Well, welcome again. This is session 7 of the Teaching Weekend Conference on the signs in John's Gospel, and we're looking at the 6th sign, which is recorded for us in John chapter 9. It's the healing of the man born blind. And this is another example where the sign of the healing is linked with an I am statement, I am the light of the world, which is also linked with a discussion about who is this man, who has done this healing, what can the religious leaders learn about him, what should they be doing about him. And it's a bit hard to pull all of that apart in a separate reading, so we're going to actually hear the whole chapter read for us now. It's a long chapter, but it's important that we hear the whole lot because it's all knitted together so closely. So as we have done in the other sessions, we'll hear the reading, have a song, go into the session, and then when we close off, we'll have the chance for some question and answers. So let's hear.
So from John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbours and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he tell you to do? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple? We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains."
What gift of grace is Jesus my Redeemer? There is no more for heaven now to give. He is my joy, my righteousness and freedom, my steadfast love, my deep and boundless peace. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus, for my life is wholly bound to His. Oh, how strange and divine, I can sing, all is mine, yet not I, but through Christ in me. The night is dark, but I am not forsaken, for by my side the Savior He will stay. I labor on in weakness and rejoicing, for in my need His power is displayed. To this I hold, my shepherd will defend me. Through the deepest valley He will lead. Oh, the night has been won, and I shall overcome, yet not I, but through Christ in me. No fate I dread, I am forgiven. The future's sure, the price it has been paid. For Jesus bled and suffered for my pardon, and he was raised to overthrow the grave. To this I hold, my sin has been defeated. Jesus now and ever is my plea. Oh, the chains are released, I can sing, I am free, yet not I, but through Christ in me. With every breath I long to follow Jesus, for he has said that he will bring me home. And day by day I know he will renew me, until I stand with joy before the throne. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus. All the glory evermore to him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. Yet not I, but through Christ in me.
Thank you, Adrian. Perfect choice of song for this session. To this I hold, my shepherd will defend me. And if there's ever a story of that, it's this dear bloke. Because in chapter 10, Jesus is going to go on from this instant and explain, I am the good shepherd. And he's lived that out in this bloke's experience. Because as he's being accosted from every side and is eventually put out of the synagogue, Jesus comes and finds him and says, how you doing? Now that event, remember his parents were too frightened to speak because they would be scared of being put out of the synagogue. And eventually he is put out, it says. It's hard for us to get our minds around that. But to be put out of the synagogue was to lose all of your social connection, all of your standing, all of your respect in the community, all of your identity, to be cut off from your relatives, to be isolated from all your business practices. It would be like, for example, today, an Orthodox Jew being pushed out because they had left Orthodox Judaism, or a person who comes from a very observant Islamic background being completely cut off from that background because they've become a Christian, or something like that. To be put out of the synagogue was an identity-crushing experience. It wasn't just, oh, it's inconvenient. It actually destroyed you in terms of your social connectedness, your identity, who you were as a person, how you made your way into the world. It was the biggest possible threat that could be made to someone who came from a close-knit community like that. So this sign is a demonstrated example of how the Good Shepherd shepherds his sheep. And thank you for reading it so well. It was a long reading. The sign is amazing because there are so many assumptions underneath it. We need to touch on those in a moment. But the sign coincides with their saying, I am the light of the world, and it coincides with the conversation, the discourse, the explanation that goes on. Because you see that this in the end becomes a trial of faith. And there's this enormous contrast between this bloke who's had his eyes opened and in leaps and bounds grows in faith and his ability to give testimony to Christ, and those who should know but whose eyes are completely closed. So there's a contrast in the story, and that contrast is built on certain assumptions which people are holding, and those assumptions are shown to be wrong. The first assumption is, who sinned, this man or his parents? In other words, the only explanation that Jesus' disciples had was that sickness of any sort of misfortune must be a direct intervention of God. Bad things happen to bad people. If something bad has happened to you, it must be back in something that you've done. Now, that is not a million miles away from us. So many people today, whether they consciously express it this way or whether they hold it as an unexpressed belief, so many people operate by the principle of karma. If you've got bad things happening now, it must have been something back here, or perhaps even something further back in what your parents did, or perhaps even something further back in what your grandparents did. And then you have to go through this whole list of trying to sort out all of the tangled mess of all of this stuff that you're trudging along, carrying, and it's crushing you into the ground. And that whole set of assumptions is undone by this statement. It's got nothing to do, Jesus says, with any of that. You're asking the wrong question. The question is not even within the realms of my reference grid. Okay? So just put the question out of your mind, he's saying to them. So what happens? Jesus sees this man and he does this strange thing. What would Jesus do? Wouldn't have a clue. But in this case, he spits on some dirt and puts it on the bloke's eyes. And then he goes and tells him to wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent, and he comes back seeing. And he's over the moon. There's another set of assumptions underneath this, which is similar to the assumptions that the disciples had. And that set of assumption is not bad things happen to bad people, but only good people can do good things. We are Pharisees. We, by definition, are goodness. We are goodness personified. Jesus, by definition, can't be a good person because he's not one of us. Notice how good people define themselves and as over against other people, goodies and baddies, okay? So we define goodness. Jesus is not one of us. He can't be good. So the assumption is Jesus can't do a good thing because he doesn't believe what we believe. Does that assumption ever happen in churches? No, never, ever. I see you're all disagreeing with me and none of you are smiling about it. Happens all the time, doesn't it? We define ourselves as the good lot, they're the bad lot. Only good stuff can happen in our patch, bad stuff happens out there. If something good happens out there, it must not be true. And so we go through this whole process of working out how to deny the stuff on the basis of the assumptions that we bring to it. You see all of those battles happening in this remarkable conversation. And the dear bloke himself just grows in faith from one conversation to another. Who did this? Well, I don't know, is his first response. And then they go a little bit further and say, but what do you say? Well, he says, at least he's got to be a prophet, doesn't he? And they say, oh, how could he ever be a prophet? Who does blah, 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 blah. And then he goes on a little bit further and he says, well, here's an amazing thing. You're supposed to be the educated ones of Israel and you don't know how he can do this. I'm rather with this bloke rather than you guys. And that's when they put him out. He sort of just received the fullness of God, and in the matter of hours, he's sort of growing into the stature where he can give testimony and realise that if Jesus can do this for him and he is in Jesus' care, it doesn't matter what they do to him in the synagogue. And he's given voice. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. Well, here's a strange thing, he says. You blokes are supposed to be the teachers of Israel and you don't have a clue. Well, I'll tell you what. I was blind and now I can see. Top that. It's a beautiful story. Now, light, as we read the sign, light and darkness in John are spiritual categories. So this sign is understanding the difference between, helping us to understand the difference between spiritual light and spiritual darkness, but helping us to understand that through a physical sign. So this man's physical darkness was not because of his sin, but the spiritual blindness that his sight reveals is because of sin. Can you see that? His physical blindness was not because of sin, but his physical sight reveals the spiritual blindness of the others, which is because of their sin, because they've refused to believe in the Son of Man. So spiritual categories of light and dark are not unfamiliar. We talk about dark forces, dark materials, the dark arts, and many systems of thought contrast light and darkness. But most of those, when you're thinking about yin and yang, you know, the two intersecting things match together and one's dark and one's light. The problem with those is they present light and darkness as equal and opposite alternatives, which have got an eternal existence. In the Scriptures, darkness is an oppressive force which has no place in the original creation, but which is opposed to God. And the concept of light cannot be separated from Christ in the Scriptures. He is, he says, the light of the world. He says that in John chapter 9 verse 5 that we've heard in the reading, and he says, makes a similar statement in John chapter 8. The light then is that which is enlightened by Christ. The darkness is that which refuses to be enlightened by Christ. And the strange thing that we read in John chapter 3 is that men have loved darkness rather than light. He says, let me just read that chapter, that verse to you. John chapter 3. It's in that well-known passage about the new birth with Nicodemus. But it says in verse 17, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Those who believe in him, so it's back to faith, are not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned already because they have not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and the people love darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil. It's a wonderfully confronting statement by Jesus to say, my existence and my appearances in the world is the thing which is going to define what darkness is. Darkness is now defined in response to me. And coming to me as the light means that you walk in the light because you walk in me. I in you, you in me. Refusing to come to me means that you continue to walk in darkness. But you cannot escape the darkness except you come into the light. So light and darkness now are not sort of moral categories within a person that are battling away, yin and yang like. Christ is the light, and that light expels darkness, but the darkness opposes it. The darkness cannot overcome it, cannot, even though it wrestles with it, cannot overcome the light, because the light finally triumphs over the darkness. To come out of the darkness is to come into relationship with Christ. And so in Isaiah chapter 42, you have a great statement that He, God, is with His servant, and He will be one who will bring light to the darkness, to open the eyes of the blind. And Jesus Himself takes that up when He preaches His first sermon, and He says, today is the day of the Lord's favour, because He says this scripture, where it talks about releasing the captives, the recovery of sight to the blind, that has been fulfilled in me as I've read this. And the response was, let's throw Him over a cliff, because the darkness at that point did not want to come to Him and receive it. So at various other points, whether it be Paul in Acts chapter 26, he's commissioned to open the eyes of the blind, or 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 6, where it says, the light of Christ has shone into our hearts, shone into the darkness, and out of that dark spot the light has transformed them so that we now see the glory of God in the face of Christ. And then that verse from Ephesians chapter 1 verse 18, where he says, I pray that the eyes of your heart would be enlightened to understand the hope of His glory, the riches of His inheritance in the saints, and so forth. So light is always an external source. It is true in the physical world, isn't it? If you have no external source of light, you have no light. Your body has no light in it because it only sees light through a little window called your eyes. If you want light, you need an external source, the sun or the moon or an electric light. But here, Christ is always the external source, who is the light, who has come into the world. So, coming back to the sign, you've got the man who's healed, the wrong assumptions leading up to his healing. You've got the discussion with the Pharisees and all of those people who have their own set of wrong assumptions, and they have this long debate with Christ. He ends up being put out of the synagogue. Christ comes to find him, and in that finding he reveals himself to be the Good Shepherd. The important things to take away from this for us are these things. Firstly, that sort of debate that takes place between the Pharisees and the man often happen when we've got an idealised theological box through which we're trying to sieve everything. One of the things that happens when the Holy Spirit starts moving in new movements of awakening, doing a new thing which has not been seen before, is that sometimes people report things that are quite unusual. I had a friend, who is still a friend, who lived in a particular parish in a remote area of Scotland, where in that parish there had been 4 very distinct spiritual awakenings over a period of over 90 years. And there was a very elderly woman in that congregation who had lived through them. As a very elderly woman now, had reports of what her parents had experienced, what she had experienced as a child and then as a younger person, and right up to the last awakening that took place. She said this: not one of them was the same as the one that preceded it. The fruits were always the same. The fruits will always be increased love for the Lord, an increased hunger for His word, an increased love for His people, an increased evidence of the fruit of the Spirit. Those things will always appear. But how they start to appear, where the green shoots come from, what God does, none of those movements were the same. She said to my friend when he was a younger minister there, the amazing thing is that the people from the previous spiritual movement often missed the blessing of the next one because they thought it had to fit into exactly the same box that it fitted in last time. And one thing you can be sure of, if God does something once, He generally doesn't do it twice. You know, if God's done has one means of doing something in a person's life, He's not going to do exactly that same thing in the next person's life, next to them. He tailor-makes what needs to happen. Does that make sense to us? So as that awakening happens, people experience God's first initial movements differently. Do you remember we were talking in the session about the secrecy of the sign of the water into wine? And very often when Christ starts working in the life of a person, they're not quite sure where this is coming from. They don't know how this change is taking place. The head waiter knew, but no one else knew. So it is with spiritual movements. So the first thing to take away from this as we read this sign is when the new works of God start to emerge, don't be too quick to try and judge them through your own little spiritual box and say it has to be this way or it's not true. Do you know what I mean? That things will unfold over time. And that which is true will prove itself to be true over time. The second thing to take away from this as we read the sign is that as Christ came to this man, He comes to us. This man didn't know Christ was there. He's blind. Christ comes to him. Now, sometimes people brought people to Christ. Andrew, the disciple, is notable for that. Whenever you read of Andrew's name in the Scriptures, he's bringing someone to meet Christ. He's a beautiful fellow like that. But actually, Christ is the one who comes to meet us. He's always taking the initiative. And our eyes, spiritually speaking, have to be opened. We would have no idea who Christ is unless He revealed Himself to us. This is not a process of discovery, but revelation. So just as Christ came to this man and took the initiative to open his eyes, so the whole history of the gospel is that Christ comes, Christ takes the initiative, Christ does the work, He brings the opening of the eyes of the heart, and then He is the one who stands to protect. This thing I hold. Christ, my shepherd, will defend me. And the third and final thing to take away from this sign, if Christ is the source of that spiritual light, and He is the only source of spiritual light, all of our how could I put it in the best way? All of our religious experience has to be Christocentric. Sometimes we can be so bound up with the church as an entity that we miss Christ in the midst of the church. The church is not the light of the world. Christ is the light of the world. And we love, and I'm saying this really carefully because I know the building we're standing in and I know the history and the traditions that we hold close to us in our churches. But Christ as the person is the hope for the world. Whether the institution and structure of the church is the hope of the world is not the question. So sometimes we can get so concerned with the life of the church and preserving the life of the church and keeping the institution of the church together and stopping the institution from falling over, that we forget that Christ is the only external source of light. Now, I'm trying to say that gently because I know we love the church, as we should. But I don't think we love God's church more than Christ does, who loved her and gave herself to her and for her. And sometimes as the source of light for the world, God sort of has to break open the walls of the church a bit. Because we tend to live, don't we, within our walls, and we tend to want to be people who get other people inside our walls. But the light of Christ shining to the darkest corners of the world doesn't need all of the things that we think must happen in order for that light to shine. And that's part of the issue behind his conflict with the Pharisees here. Because he's saying, I am the light of the world. He's saying what this man has experienced physically, the world is going to experience spiritually through the testimony of men like him. And they're saying, that doesn't fit our box, close it down. We can fall into that same category where we want to be so concerned about ourselves, our history, our tradition, our theology, our doctrine, that actually that the light shines in the world is not our first concern. Now, I'm just saying that gently, but I think it needs to be said, if that's okay. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us coming to the end of the sixth sign. We have one more to go, which will be the raising of Lazarus. You all know that story, don't you? And that's going to be recorded tomorrow morning during the church services tomorrow morning. And then tomorrow afternoon, I think it's at 2 o'clock, is it? 2 o'clock. We've got one more session back here where we're going to try and bring some of those threads together, have a bit of a discussion and some closing prayer before we all go back home. But we'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much for your attention and attendance, and we will see you all next time. Thank you.